Hey boys and girls, if you remember last time, Ariadne was on a stool trying to listen to Mrs. Driver and Cramp Furl, and she wiped out, and they thought they heard something. Well, Cramp Furl did, and Mrs. Driver told them no. So here we go with chapter 13. Homily was ironing, bending and banging and pushing the hair back out of her eyes. All around the room, underclothes hung airing on safety pins, which Homily used like coat hangers. Safety pins, coat hangers. What happened? Asked Homily. Did you fall over? Yes, said Ariadne, moving quietly into her place beside the fire. How's the feeling coming? Oh, I don't know, said Ariadne. She clasped her knees and laid her chin on them. Where's your knitting? Asked Homily. I don't know what's come over you lately. Always idle. You don't feel seedy, do you? Idle means that you don't move around much. You just sit around. Oh, exclaimed Ariadne, let me be. And Homily was silent. It's the spring, she told herself. Used to take me like that sometimes at her age. I must see that boy, Ariadne was thinking, staring blindly into the fire. I must hear what happened. I must hear if they're all right. I don't want us to die out. I don't want us to be the last borrowers. I don't want... And here Ariadne dropped her face onto her knees. To live forever and ever like this in the dark under the floor. No good getting supper, said Homily, breaking the silence. Your father's gone borrowing to her room, and you know what that means. Ariadne raised her head. No, she said, hardly listening. What does that mean? That he won't be back, said Homily sharply, for a good hour and a half. He likes it up there, gossiping with her and poking about on the dressing table, and it's safe enough once the boy's in bed. Not that there's anything we want special, she went on. It's just these new shelves he's made. They look kind of bare. He says just pick up a little something. Ariadne suddenly was sitting bolt upright. A thought had struck her, leaving her breathless and a little shaky at the knees. A good hour and a half, her mother had said, and the gates would be open. Where are you going? Asked Homily as Ariadne moved toward the door. Oh, just along the storerooms, said Ariadne, shading with one hand her candle dip from the draught. I won't be long. Now you don't untidy anything, Homily called out after her, and be careful of that light. As Ariadne went down the passage, she thought, it is true, I am going to the storerooms to find another hat pin, and if I do find a hat pin and a piece of string, there won't be any name tape. I still won't be long because I'll have to get back before Papa, and I'm doing it for their sakes, she told herself doggedly, and one day they'll thank me. All the same, she felt a little guilty. Artful, that's what Mrs. Driver would say she was. There was a hat pin, one with a bar for a top, and she tied on a piece of string very firmly, twisting it back and forth like a figure of 8, and as a crowning inspiration, she sealed it with sealing wax. The gates were open, and she left the candle in the middle of the passage where it could come to no harm just below the hole by the clock. The great hall, when she had climbed out into, was dim with shadows. A single gas jet turned low made a pool of light beside the locked front door, and another faintly flickered on the landing halfway up the stairs. The ceiling sprang away into the height and darkness, and all around was space. The night nursery, she knew, was at the end of the upstairs passage, and the boy would be in bed. Her mother had just said so. Ariadne had watched her father use his pin on the chair, and single stairs, in comparison, were easier. There was a kind of rhythm to it after a while, a throw, a pull, a scramble, and an upward swing. The stair rods glinted coldly, but the pile of the carpet seemed soft and warm and delicious to fall back on. On the half landing, she paused to get her breath. She did not mind the semi-darkness. She lived in darkness. She was at home, and in a time like this, it made her feel safe. On the upper landing, she saw an open door and a great square of golden light, which, like a barrier, lay across the passage. I've got to pass through that, Ariadne told herself, trying to be brave. Inside the lighted room, a voice was talking, droning on. And this mare, the voice said, was a 5-year-old, which really belonged to my brother in Ireland, not my elder brother, but my younger brother, the one who owned Stalemate. And, oh, my darling, he had entered her for several point-to-points. But when I say several, I mean 3 or at least 2. Have you ever seen an Irish point-to-point? No, said another voice, rather absent-mindedly. That's my father, Arrietty realized with a start. My father talking to Great Aunt Sophie, or rather Great Aunt Sophie talking to my father. She gripped her pin with its loops of string and ran into the light and threw it to the passage beyond. As she passed the open door, she had a glimpse of firelight and lamplight and gleaming furniture and dark red silk brocade. Beyond the square of light, the passage was dark again, and she could see at the far end a half-open door. That's the day nursery, she thought, and beyond that is the night nursery. There are certain differences, Aunt Sophie's voice went on, which would strike you at once. For instance, Arrietty liked the voice. It was comforting and steady, like the sound of the clock in the hall, and as she moved off the carpet onto the strip of polished floor beside the skirting board, she was interested to hear there were walls in Ireland instead of hedges. Here by the skirting, she could run, and she loved running. Carpets were heavy going, thick and clinging, and they held you up. The boards were smooth and smelled of beeswax. She liked that smell. The schoolroom, when she reached it, was shrouded in dust sheets and full of junk. Here, too, a gas jet burned, turned low to a bluish flame. The floor was linoleum, rather worn, and the rugs were shabby. Under the table was a great cavern of darkness. She moved into it, feeling about, and bumped into a dusty hassock higher than her head. Coming out again into the half-light, she looked up and saw the corner cupboard with the doll's tea service, the painting above the fireplace, and the plush curtain where her father had been seen. Chair legs were everywhere, and chair seats obscured her view. She found her way among them to the door of the night nursery, and there she saw, suddenly, on a shadowed plateau in the far corner, the boy in bed. She saw his great face turned toward her on the edge of the pillow. She saw the gaslight reflected in his open eyes. She saw his hand gripping the bedclothes, the sheets, holding them tightly pressed against his mouth. She stopped moving and stood still. After a while, when she saw his fingers relax, she said softly, "Don't be frightened. It's me, Arrietty." He let the bedclothes slide away from his mouth and said, "Whatty?" He seemed annoyed. "Eddie," she repeated gently. "Did you take the letter?" He stared at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Why did you come creeping into my room?" "I didn't come creeping, said Arrietty. "I even ran, didn't you see?" He was silent, staring at her with his great, wide-open eyes. "When I brought the book," he said at last, "you had gone." "I had to go. Tea was ready. My father fetched me." He understood this. "Oh," he said matter-of-factly, and did not reproach her. "Did you take the letter?" she asked again. "Yes," he said. "I had to go back twice. I shoved it down the badger's hole." Suddenly, he threw back the bedclothes and stood up in bed, enormous in his pale flannel nightshirt. It was Arrietty's turn to be afraid. She half turned, her eyes on his face, and began backing slowly toward the door. But he did not look at her. He was feeling behind a picture on the wall. "Here it is," he said, sitting down again, and the bed creaked loudly. "But I don't want it back," exclaimed Arrietty, coming forward again. "You should have left it there. Why did you bring it back?" He turned it over in his fingers. "He's written on it," he said. "Oh, please," cried Arrietty excitedly. "Show me." She ran right up to the bed and tugged at the trailing sheet. "Then they are alive. Did you see him?" "No," he said. "The letter was there, just down the hole where I'd put it." He leaned toward her. "But he's written on it. Look." She made a quick dart and almost snatched the letter out of his great fingers, but was careful to keep out of range of his hand. She ran with it to the door of the schoolroom where the light, though dim, was a little brighter. "It's very faint," she said, holding it close to her eyes. "What's he written it with, I wonder? It's all in capitals." She turned suddenly. "Are you sure you didn't write it?" she asked. "Of course not," he began. "I write small." but she had seen by his face that he spoke the truth and began to spell out the letters. T-E-double-L, she said. Tell, Y-O-R-E. She looked up. Your, she said. Yes, said the boy, your. Tell your A-N-T. Aunt, said Arrietty. Aunt, my aunt? The boy was silent, waiting. Aunt, L-U-O, Aunt Loopy. It was spelled like Ant the bug. She exclaimed. He says, listen, this is what he says. Tell your Aunt Loopy to come home. There was a silence. Then tell her, said the boy after a moment. Here's the picture. Uh-oh, I turned the page. Oh, no, I didn't. But she isn't here, exclaimed Arrietty. She's never been here. I don't even remember what she looked like. Look, said the boy, staring through the door. Someone's coming. Arrietty whipped around. There was no time to hide. It was Pod, borrowing bag in one hand and pin in the other. He stood in the doorway of the schoolroom. Quite still he stood, outlined against the light in the passage, his little shadow falling dimly in front of him. He had seen her. I heard your voice, he said, and there was a dreadful quietness about the way he spoke. Just as I was coming out of her room. Arrietty stared back at him, stuffing the letter up her jersey. Could he see beyond her into the shadowed room? Could he see the tousled shape in bed? Come on home, said Pod, and turned away. Chapter 14. Pod did not speak until they reached the sitting room, nor did he look at her. She had had to scramble after him as best as she might. He had ignored her efforts to help him shut the gates, but once, when she tripped, he had waited until she had got up again, watching her, it seemed, almost without interest while she brushed the dust off her knees. He was upset that she snuck out. Supper was laid and the ironing put away, and Homily came running in from the kitchen, surprised to see them together. Pod threw down his borrowing bag. He stared at his wife. What's the matter? Faltered Homily, looking from one to the other. She was in the night nursery, said Pod quietly, talking to that boy. Homily moved forward, her hands clasped tremblingly against her apron, her startled eyes flickering swiftly to and fro. Oh, no, she breathed. Pod sat down. He ran a tired hand over his eyes and forehead. His face looked heavy like a piece of dough. Now what? He said. Homily stood quite still, bowed over her clasped hands, and stared at Arrietty. Oh, you never, she whispered. They are frightened, Arrietty realized. They are not angry at all. They are very, very frightened. She moved forward. It's all right, she began. Homily sat down suddenly on the cotton spool. She had begun to tremble. Oh, she said, whatever shall we do? She began to rock herself very slightly to and fro. Oh, Mother, don't, pleaded Arrietty. It isn't so bad as that. It really isn't. She felt up the front of her jersey. At first, she could not find the letter. It had slid down her side to the back. But at last she drew it out, very crumpled. Look, she said, here's a letter from Uncle Henry. I wrote to him, and the boy took the letter. You wrote to him? Cried Homily on a kind of suppressed shriek. Oh, she moaned and closed her eyes. Whatever next? Whatever shall we do? And she fanned herself limply with her bony hand. Get your mother a drink of water, Arrietty, said Pod sharply. Arrietty brought it in with a sawed-off hazel shell. It had been sawed off at the pointed end and was shaped like a brandy glass. But whatever made you do such a thing, Arrietty, said Homily more calmly, setting the empty cup down on the table. Whatever came over you? So Arrietty told them about being seen that day under the cherry tree and how she had kept it from them not to worry them, and what the boy said about dying out, and how, more than important, how imperative it had seemed to make sure the Hendrys were alive. Do understand, pleaded Arrietty. Please understand. I'm trying to save our race. The expressions she uses, said Homily to Pod under her breath, not without pride. But Pod was not listening. Save the race, he repeated grimly. It's people like you, my girl, who do things sudden like this with no respect for tradition. Who'll finish us borrowers once and for all? Don't you see what you've done? Arrietty met his accusing eyes. Yes, she said falteringly, I've got in touch with the only other ones still alive. So that, she went on bravely, from now on, we can all stick together. All stick together, Pod repeated angrily. Do you think the Hendrerys lot would ever come back to live here? Can you see your mother emigrating to a badger set 2 fields away, out in the open and no hot water laid on? Never, cried Homily in a full, rich voice, which made them both turn and look at her. Or do you see your mother walking across 2 fields in a garden, went on Pod? 2 fields full of crows and cows and horses and whatnot, to take a cup of tea with your Aunt Loopy, whom she never liked much anyway? But wait, he said as Arrietty tried to speak, that's not the point. As far as all that goes, we're just where we was. The point, he went on, leaning forward and speaking with great solemnity, is this. That boy knows now where we live. Oh, no, said Arrietty. I never told him that. You told him, interrupted Pod, about the kitchen pipe bursting. You told him how all our stuff got washed away to the grating. He sat back again, glaring at her. He's only got to think, he pointed out. Arrietty was silent, and Pod went on. That's a thing that has never happened before. Never in the whole long history of the borrowers. Borrowers have been seen, yes. Borrowers have been caught, maybe. But no human being has ever known where any borrower lived. We're in very grave danger, Arrietty, and you've put us there, and that's a fact. Oh, Pod, whimpered Homily, don't frighten the child. Nay, Homily, said Pod more gently. My poor old girl, I don't want to frighten no one, but this is serious. Suppose I said to you, pack up tonight all our bits and pieces, where would you go? Not to Hendreary's, cried Homily. Not there, Pod. I couldn't never share a kitchen with Loopy. No, agreed Pod, not to Hendreary's, and don't you see for why? The boy knows about that too. Oh, cried Homily in real dismay. Yes, said Pod, and a couple of smart terriers or a well-trained ferret, and that'd be the end of the whole lot of us. Oh, Pod, said Homily, and began to tremble. The thought of living in a badger set had been bad enough, but the thought of not having even that to go to seemed almost worse. And I dare say I could have got in nice in the end, she said, providing we lived quite separate. Well, it's no good thinking of it now, said Pod. He turned to Arrietty. What does your Uncle Hendreary say in the letter? Yes, exclaimed Homily. Where is the letter? It doesn't say much, said Arrietty, passing over the paper. It just says, tell your Aunt Loopy to come home. What? Exclaimed Homily sharply, looking at the letter upside down. Come home? What can he mean? He means, said Pod, that Loopy must have set off to come here and that she never arrived. Set off to come here, repeated Homily, but when? How should I know, said Pod. It doesn't say when, said Arrietty. But, exclaimed Homily, it might have been weeks ago. It might, said Pod, long enough away for him to want her back. Oh, cried Homily, all those poor little children. Well, they're growing up now, said Pod. But something must have happened to her, exclaimed Homily. Yes, said Pod. He turned to Arrietty. See what I mean, Arrietty, about those fields? Oh, Pod, said Homily, her eyes full of tears. I don't suppose none of us will ever see poor Loopy again. Well, we wouldn't have anyway, said Pod. Pod, said Homily soberly, I'm frightened. Everything seems to be happening at once. What are we going to do? Well, said Pod, there's nothing we can do tonight. That's certain. But a bit of supper and a good night's rest. He rose to his feet. Oh, Arrietty, wailed Homily suddenly, you naughty, wicked girl. How could you go and start all this? How could you go and talk to the human being? If only... I was seen, cried Arrietty. I couldn't help being seen. Papa was seen. I don't think it's all as awful as you're trying to make out. I don't think human beings are all that bad. They're bad and they're good, said Pod. They're honest and they're artful. It's just as it takes them at the moment. And animals, if they could talk, would say the same. Steer clear of them. That's what I've always been told. No matter what they promise you, no good ever really came to no one from any human being. And that's the end for today. We'll see what happens next.